Welcome to Watercolour Wildlife. In these technique videos, I'm just going to go through some essential techniques that I think you need to kind of get started in painting in watercolour. So I'm going to start with the basics, I suppose. One brush, grab yourself a medium brush. You can kind of practice these. And we're going to start with the most common technique, I suppose, that you'll use, and probably the most intuitive painting technique that you'll use, and that is wet on dry. So as the name suggests, fairly logical. It's using wet paint on dry paper. So just going to mix up a little bit of paint there. Start somewhere up here in the corner, and you know, this is wet on dry. Painting as you would have as a child, you know, picking up paint, putting it onto dry paper. There are lots of different marks and ways you can use this technique, obviously, depending on the amount of water you have on your brush, whether you want to do dry brushing, for example. So I haven't got a lot of water on my brush at the moment, and you'll see as it dries out, I start getting these gaps, I suppose, and that's indicative of the dry brush technique. So you can see you leave these gaps there. I'm using my brush on the side, and you get a nice dry brush effect. Whereas it's still, with a little bit of paint on, if I was to use the point, still get a nice even colour. But you see as it's drying out, it's starting to leave those patches, and that's often works well to your advantage where you want to leave highlights. You know, this could be the reflection in water or a texture in fur or all of those sorts of things. So it's just, when I refer to dry brushing, that's what it is. And yeah, so if I increase the amount of water and paint, you can see that it goes back to producing a nice smooth, consistent, even, relatively even colour. And you can obviously do, with a brush like this, you can do fine lines, holding it up on end, lay it out flat, use the side of the brush to produce more abstract shapes, or use it like you would, I suppose, intuitively use a brush and just paint with it. Yeah, so the more paint you've got on there, and the more water you've got on there, kind of more even texture you're going to get. If you wanted to cover a nice even area, you do it with a fair bit of paint. You want to avoid these pools. We don't need to avoid them, but if you might just want to lift them out, you get a nice even coverage. So yeah, that's wet on dry, I suppose. You could call this dry on dry almost. So it's that dry brush technique. So wet on dry, that obviously leads us into wet on wet. And how you start with that is you have a wet surface, obviously. So this is going to give you, I'm just going to spread out a little bit of water on there. I've put a little bit of blue in that just so that you can see it. If I use pure water, you can't often see where I've applied the water. So there's a little bit of blue in there just so that you can see it. Now if I do the same thing, so take, you know, a fair bit of paint on and water onto my brush and start doing the same thing. So I could start with that line. You can see, obviously, it's going to immediately bleed, and you get these wonderful patterns. And softer edges, so it's really useful for things like fur. At the edges of an animal, you can use this, and it bleeds out, and it will create the effect of fur. Maybe not in blue, but you get the idea. And even a little bit of splashing here, so you could just splash, and you get some really lovely effects. So that's wet in wet. And obviously you can control this. I'm going to show you a few perhaps mistakes with this. You don't want it to be too wet. So if I put too much water on, you see it starts to puddle up a little bit. And then I start applying paint to that. It's kind of going to bleed out and run into puddles. I mean, it's still lovely if that's the effect you're after. You know, play around with technique, it's not necessarily wrong. But you see how it's all starting to run down here, and it'll all start pooling up, which sometimes is quite nice. But yeah, if you want to lift out, there's a bit too much water here, so you can use a dry brush just to lift out some of them. If you did put too much water down, just lift out some of this water and then wipe it away. So that's wet in wet. Now, there's a very brief explanation. I'm going to go into these in detail in all of the tutorials that are in this. We will be using all of these techniques in each painting, you know, or some of these, or combination, using some, not others. So that's where they'll really come to life, I suppose. I just want you to be able to understand, when we're doing the tutorials, the terminology, I suppose, that I'm using. So yeah, wet in wet. The other thing you can do very effectively with both wet on dry and wet in wet is mix colour. So you could say we want to produce a green. Obviously we're going to need some yellow. So I'm just going to grab a little bit of this lemon yellow that I have here. I'm actually going to grab a little bit more out of my box. Pop a little bit. So now I can mix this on the palette, a little bit of yellow with a little bit of this, make myself a green, and apply that green. So this is the colour that I would end up with, or you know, a different variation thereof. What you can also do is I could also put this yellow on over this blue while it's still wet. And again, you can see where that mixes, you're getting that green. And it's quite a nice way of doing it, where I've got a quite even colour green here. We're getting a bit more variation, I suppose, so bits of yellow and bits of blue. So yeah, that's a technique that I use a lot, is actually just mixing the colours on the page rather than mixing them in the palette. So that's wet in wet. So obviously there I've just used clean water, and then there put in the yellow. You can do a similar thing once it's dry, so by layering. So this is pretty much dry now. If I layered this up, so I've got just yellow on my brush here, and then just applied it over half of that. The yellow over the blue, even though it's dry, is obviously producing that green. And the benefit of doing this, I suppose, is that your underlying layer is going to stay pretty crisp. So you see, because it's dry, and if I don't move my brush around all over it and wash it, you know, if I do it in a few loose strokes, a few light strokes, it won't actually affect the paint underneath, in that it won't move around, so you retain these lines. So if I go over this bit, you can see that you start getting that layering effect. You've got to do it gently. If you do start doing lots of strokes, I'll do a little bit here. So if you do start doing lots of strokes, it's going to obviously blend more. But you'll see even there, it's still leaving this quite defined lines underneath, and that's a really good way of building up textures, layering paint, you know, leaving a layer to dry, putting a layer on top. So yeah, kind of 3 ways of mixing colour there, and that's in the palette. Wet in wet, so on the page, just letting, you know, this is the most unpredictable, and I really like it. You could flick in a little bit more yellow, see, and you just start getting these. I mean, this is almost kind of looking like a blue tip that I might paint. And what you can do is leave that to dry, let it bleed, and then perhaps use wet on dry on top of your wet in wet. So you get a combination of this lovely soft blending in the background and on the edges and stuff, and then leave it to dry and start flicking over the top. So you'll see this is now dry, and if I flick over that, I've got that lovely wet in wet effect underneath, and I'll just start flicking some yellow into it, and you see how it's not bleeding. You're just ending up with a slightly green colour, I suppose. I think my yellow has gone slightly green, but yeah, where it's showing through, it's turning that blue green, and it's not bleeding out, so you can control where they're going. And once that is dry, we could look at doing that over the top to build those textures. So yeah, lots of ways of producing stuff depending on whether your paper's wet or dry, or whether you're leaving it to dry or carry on working on it. Something you've got to watch out a little bit for is muddying up your colours. So especially with wet in wet like this, if you mix too many colours like this, they're likely to bleed together and turn a bit muddy. So you don't want to be mixing too many colours. If I was going to introduce, I don't know, say a red into my painting, I would probably leave this to dry. I mean, so let me show you, just flicking a little bit of red in there and see what happens. It can go a little bit muddy. You see the red looks quite vibrant at the moment, but as that dries, it will kind of merge together, and I mean, it might look quite nice, but you probably want to put a layer of dry brush work over it, just to bring back some of the detail, because that is going to merge out, but I'll show you that later. The other thing, while this patch I suppose is still quite wet, a technique that I use a lot is lifting out, and you'll see that I pretty much always have a piece of kitchen roll on or near me. I'll grab a new piece for this. So there are a few ways of doing this, but lifting out is basically just removing the paint from the page. And you can do that to a certain extent once it's dry, but if it's wet like this, you can, so let's say we want to take out a lot of this corner, I would just use my tissue paper and dab it. It's because it's been there on the page a little while, it has left this mark around the edge, but you can see how we've removed the vast majority of that paint, and that would be described as lifting out. Now I've done it flat there with the piece and just tried to get all of the water up there. Now I'm going to, you can do textures, so you can screw up a piece of paper into whatever shapes, and then start taking off the paint in more abstract ways, I suppose. So there's a little dab, creates a nice little effect. I've used that in sheep to look like wool. You can dab it like that. Something that I often do as well is twist up my kitchen roll so that it is, like that. And then you can use this to make various different shapes. So I can bend that into, a circle potentially, or just a straight line. Make lots of different shapes for it, and then remove big sections like that. That might be useful for hair. Again, adding texture. If you've put too much paint down, you can lift it out. And there, like a circle, perhaps I wanted to do a highlight around an eye or something. You could potentially just do that, lift it out with a piece of toilet roll. I use toilet roll in pretty much, or kitchen roll in pretty much all of my paintings for lifting out. The other way you can lift out is to use a paintbrush. So let's pick a spot. You can do this obviously in wet and dry areas. So if we look at this area around here, I can use a brush just to start lifting some of this out. And what I'll use is a piece of my tissue paper just to dab it, clean water, and just start brushing away where you don't want and lifting the paint out. So you're lifting and getting rid of that paint. You don't want to just end up scrubbing the paint around, you want to actually take that paint off. So you can work into that area, lifting out the paint, drying it off, and you can get drier and drier with your brush. And that was on quite a wet area, so it comes off quite easily usually. This is dry now, it's totally dry, this blue, so you can still do it on this area. Say I started working like that. I'd then clean my brush, lift out pigment. And you'll have to work a bit harder on this. Careful not to damage your paper. So do it lightly, but you can lift out quite a lot of paint like that. And then when you've painted that, I mean, if you do want to, you could just dab out, soften. Then that's virtually dry again. You can use as well, the other thing, I suppose not lifting out, but while you've got wet areas, I often splash with clear water. So I'm just going to do that while it's still wet there. So it's, and you see that's just clear water onto wet surface. So wet in wet, but just using clear water to apply it. You see how it does almost the same thing. So it's clearing paint away. So where the water's hit, it will disperse the paint out and you'll end up with these lighter highlights. So yeah, lots of different effects you can create just with a couple of techniques there. So we've got wet in wet, wet in dry. We've done a bit of splashing and we've done a bit of lifting out really. And those cover, I'd say probably 80% of the mark making that I do in a painting. It's a lot of playing around, and it's those techniques that I'll use predominantly. So yeah, just get used to those terms. So I suppose the other thing is brush strokes and using different brushes to achieve different effects, and why I use the different brushes. I mean, a lot of it hopefully should be fairly intuitive and easy to understand. You want to cover a big area, do it with a big brush. You want to do detail work, use a smaller brush. I use bigger brushes to, I suppose, provide a bit of looseness to my paintings. If you use a really tiny brush, you can obviously paint really detailed. If you use a bigger brush, basically impossible to paint it too detailed. So that gives your paintings a looseness that I quite like. So I basically use these 4 brushes, and the marks I make are usually very quick and spontaneous, but I'll just show you from this big brush. Let's maybe use a bit of this green up. See what we've got. Now you can see how I've sort of chiseled that into a shape just by flattening it out on my palette. So that can be the first kind of mark that I'm going to make, can be these fine lines that you could make with it. So these stroking motions, this could be the wings on a bird. So, you know, you want just some lines, and, you know, a bit of splashing like that is quite nice. And again, you can use this for splashing. A lot of paint on there. It's going to drip, which is okay in my kind of painting. So these are good for this kind of effect. We've also covered a little bit there, the kind of the dry brushing techniques. So a big brush is going to be able to cover large areas like this. You know, good for a background. You cover big areas quite quickly. You can also get a lot of pigment onto the page quite quickly. So I could just put a bit of yellow in there. You know, cover big areas. Keeps your brushwork loose. So I try and use as big a brush as possible, I suppose, for most of my work, and then only really go down into smaller brushes when I need that detail and that control. So yeah, lots of different shapes you can make. Sable brushes are a little bit more, I suppose, malleable in that they'll hold a bit of a shape like that. You don't tend to get a synthetic brush that holds its shape. Yeah, when you angle it like that, they'll tend to spring into their natural shape. So I can show you what I mean. Here's a synthetic brush. There's a good comparison. And there's my synthetic brush, and I mean that's doing a pretty good job actually, but you see how it springs back. If I bend it, it springs back. So I'm just going to show you that down here. Some water on there. I do that and it springs back to its natural shape, which is nice, but it doesn't hold. You know, I can get a bit of a sort of a point on there, but certainly no fixed curve on that. Whereas if I do it with the sable brush, you can see if I put it on its side like that, it maintains that that curve in there, and that, you know, I can then use the side of the brush there to do dry brushing, or I can form this point that I can get quite fine lines with for such a big brush. You know, if you're really light and you work like that, you know, really quick movements, you can produce quite fine lines. So yeah, a good comparison there, I suppose, between the sable brush and the synthetic brush. You'll also see, I suppose, at the ends here, and this is, I suppose, also down to the quality of the brushes and how they are made. You know, these will be made in a factory by a machine, and all of those hairs will be fed into there by a machine. These are made by hand, and they get it right with a handmade brush, I suppose. You know, it's individual attention. When I splay out the end of this brush, you can see it's much more, it gives a much more jagged edge, I suppose. Put a bit of water on this one, just compare those. They get quite a solid, I'm just going to spread that out a bit. It's quite nice and even there. The hairs here, it's a bit more jagged and spaced out. You can see those hairs aren't quite forming, and they tend to break up a bit like that. They don't hold quite as much water. But listen, it's still a paintbrush and it'll work. I quite happily still do the same things that I've done. And it just, after years of painting, you kind of get used to the stuff that you use. So you can still do the same with this, you know. Actually, a synthetic brush is probably better for flicking, or you'll certainly get more power out of it, because it will flick. What I showed you, it just flicks back to its original position. You're going to get quite a strong flick. I need a bit more water on that for it to. And you see, they don't seem to retain as much water, but I'll put more water on there, and then, yeah, you see, it's quite good for flicking. I just wouldn't be able to flick. I wouldn't go, oh, I need a synthetic brush because I'm going to do some flicking. You know, I just use the same hand. But actually, you know, for flicking, these are probably better than a sable brush. If you watch what I do when I flick with this, I mean, that's quite good. You can get quite a whip on that, to be honest. It's interesting. I've never made this direct comparison before, but it definitely doesn't spring back as much. Yeah, you kind of have to flick it quite hard to get anything, and then it goes out. I'd say you've got more control there with a synthetic brush. Well, here is a good opportunity to lift out, for example. So the technique we used up here of lifting out, got some big puddles of splashing, and I like splashing and, you know, marks that weren't intended. But if you did want to just help dry them quicker and just lift out a little bit, you can just dip in the end of a bit of tissue paper. You can also do it with a brush. So I'll just show you that. You just touch it in the top and it will soak up most of that water, just help it dry a bit faster. And you can do this with a brush as well. So lifting out, you kind of get a dry brush and just dip it in, and it just sucks it up. It's like capillary action, and it will just pull that paint off the paper, or pull the water off the paper, and hopefully leave some of the paint behind anyway. If you want a really intense colour in these, then leave them, give them a little bit longer to dry. And yeah, they'll take longer to dry, but they probably will leave more pigment there and more intensity. So what else have we got to cover? Yeah, so the other thing I think, I suppose, is how you produce white in a painting, especially in a watercolour painting. The purists will say that you leave the white paper. I suppose that's your first option, is to not paint where you want white. I guess one of the easiest ways, also one of the hardest, or might sound like one of the easiest, but it's probably one of the hardest. So just by going like that, perhaps you wanted to do the surface of the sea or something like that, and you're doing the crests of waves, the water breaking. You're leaving these, and the aim would be, you could probably build up different colours in here, but the aim would be to always leave those white areas that aren't painted as just pure paper showing through. And that's how watercolour artists will generally produce the colour, white within their painting, is to leave it blank. So yeah, leaving it out, the first way of producing white in a painting. Second way, I guess, is with gouache, and this is useful, and I use this all the time. I use this technique of leaving out the white, obviously, all the time, but I like the effects that you get with gouache, and that gouache is an opaque white paint, so it's watercolour based, but it's got, I suppose it's like watercolour from tubes in a way, but it's very opaque, and you can apply it over the top of other colours. So if I show you, I'll squeeze out a little bit. I have various shades of this in there from using it in the past, but this is all white gouache. And basically, the thicker you use it, the more coverage you're going to get from that paint. So it's going to cover more, or allow the paint that's underneath to show through. So I'm just going to go in there. I've got very little water on my brush. I've got my rigger brush here. So I'm just going to show you, if we wanted to paint highlights where we haven't got these, you can use this to apply over the top of it. And just, I'm just using a range of strokes. And you can put anywhere you want, over here, you can apply some white, and you see it will, if you go thick, not too much water, it will pretty much completely cover whatever is underneath it. So it's useful for the highlights in eyes. Sometimes it's hard unless you're going to mask it out. It's hard to leave a little highlight in an eye sometimes, so sometimes it's nice to just be able to go in with this white gouache and just paint in little bits. The other thing I like doing with gouache is flicking over the top of things, just to produce some white kind of speckled highlights. I'll often do that in a painting, so I'll grab some clean water. Okay, and you want the mix to be as strong as possible, not too watery, but it needs to be watery enough to leave the brush. So I'm just going to show you over this green patch. If I was to flick, yeah, I will often do that. The other thing I like, and part of the reason that I use gouache, not just for producing the highlights necessarily, but I really like the effect that it gives when it mixes with wet watercolour. So wet in wet, I'm going to create a little space here. I'll create an area that I can show you exactly what I mean. So I'm just going to paint a nice blue area. It's a little bit dark, but it doesn't really matter what colour I've got. Just going with this blue. I'm just going to put down a patch of blue there and flick a little bit of this white gouache into it. You can see there how it bleeds, and I just really like that effect, those star effects. You won't necessarily get complete coverage with that white. If you're applying it into wet paint, it's going to bleed out and it's going to become more transparent. It's going to mix with the paint that's already there. So yeah, it's just a bit more, I like the effect that it gives. It's a bit more random, not as controlled. If you want it controlled, you do it over a dry painting underneath, basically. So in any of these dry areas, I could splash some water, some foam, I guess, on top of these waves, if these were waves. You see, in this is a good way. So say I didn't, if I was painting some sort of splash or something, I could see that all working. You don't really want this big dot there. So we could just lift it out. Leave all your other splashing in there. Just lift out these little dots. You see where I've got one here. Just dab it off. So always remember that if you're quite quick, you can use that lifting out technique. just to, yeah, try and recover some area. So even this has been here for quite a while, this little spot. And that one we were actually going to leave, it will show you, you see I haven't taken any of the paint out of that one, we just left it. Some of these others I lifted out the paint, you see how it's much darker. But for this one, look, you can still lift it out and it virtually goes, even though that green splashing was done a while ago. So yeah, lifting out with a piece of toilet roll is great. The other way of producing highlights, I sort of touched on it briefly, and that's masking. So you can use masking fluid. This is a kind of latex rubber, I suppose, that you paint onto the paper before you apply any water. So I'm going to show you a little bit. Personally, so I'm using a really cheap brush for this. I found some, I don't know, it's a cheap watercolour brush. Wouldn't have cost more than 30p or something, because this will ruin your brushes really quickly. But just going to dip a little bit in here and paint an area here. So I might want to use it for some feathers or something, or whatever highlights you want to produce. You know, you can produce the shape of an eye potentially, or the highlight in an eye. Might be difficult to see. This is a little bit coloured, so hopefully you can see this. But you could do little dots. Now what you have to do is basically wait for that to dry, and then you can paint over it with watercolours. The paint won't go where that stuff is, and you can then rub off. Once your painting is dry, you give it a gentle rub and your masking fluid comes off. Personally, I hate the stuff. I don't get on with it. I would rather put gouache over the top or try and not paint in that area. I often found that if you leave it for too long on the paper surface and you don't rub it off, sometimes it can tear the paper. It can damage it coming off. You can smudge stuff. Yeah. As I say, I don't often use it, but it is something that a lot of artists do use. And yeah, so it's up to you. You can use it in small quantities. I would use a really cheap rubbish brush that you're prepared to get ruined. And I'm just going to show you briefly another way of doing it. And one of the most successful ways I've found, or one of the ways that I did like using masking fluid, was just to paint the whiskers on animals. Often they're white and you're trying to paint around that area and just leave a really thin line of white. So one of the ways that I did try, and one of the best ways I found, was using a dip pen. So this is an ink pen, and then you can get quite thin lines that will look like whiskers. And I mean, those are probably all right, actually. Those are quite good. I've always struggled a little bit. What I did find is that you mark the paper slightly. But yeah, rather than using a brush, if I was going to use masking fluid, I would probably use it in the whiskers or in a fur texture, I guess. And I might use a dip pen to apply it. So it's going to leave that. I need to leave that to dry for a little while before I start trying to paint over it. But as soon as I am able, let's have a look. I actually don't want to get my, in case that is a bit wet, I don't want to get my sable brushes kind of anywhere near it. So I'm gonna use a really dark colour here. Sorry, let's grab some Payne's Grey so you can see the full effect. You'll see here it's definitely dry down here. I think it's a little bit wet there, but as I go over it with this, it's just going to leave those areas. I'm just going very softly over it. And you see how it's just left where the masking fluid is, the paint won't go, and then you can rub it off. You can get, I've seen people use it to good effect. And I will do a tutorial where we do use it, so we can explore how to use it and some of the problems in actually using it in a painting. You need to wait for that to dry completely. I'll probably just dab off some of the water, but once that's dry completely, you just gently rub it off and the masking fluid will come off. Another reason actually I don't tend to use masking fluid that much is that this paper actually comes with a warning to say don't use it on this paper. I think it has quite a loose structure to the paper surface, so masking fluid can penetrate into it and it can be difficult to take off it. If you're going to use masking fluid a lot, then I would recommend using I think it's more size that they use in it, and it's a stronger surface on that kind of paper. I wouldn't recommend using this if you're going to be if you're going to be using lots of masking fluid. And I'll just show you what this paper is quickly. This is the Hahnemehl Anniversary Edition that I use for pretty much all of my paintings. And as I say, it comes with a warning to not use masking fluid with it, so another reason I don't. Just putting that back, try and get that in the right place again. So we've covered, what have we covered? We've got wet in wet, or wet in dry. So wet in dry. Got wet in wet. That's allowing the paint to bleed and mix together. We've got layering, so it's allowing a layer of paint to dry underneath and then applying a wash over the top of it, more pigment over the top of it. So here we've got layering. I mean, layering is something that happens naturally in the watercolour. You know, we've also got lots of layering here. And what we've got dry brush here. Dry brush, wet brush. And then here's, this is dry brushing with gouache. So this is looking at highlights. So the three ways of producing highlights. So it's leave the white, add the white, add the white, mask the white. We've then also got, the splashing, the different brush techniques. So using brushes on their sides. So, side brushing produced these big flatter areas with more texture, I suppose. So we've got more areas that haven't been hit by the brush. We've produced fine lines. We've got splashing. And then brush strokes. The splashing, this mixing of colours as well. So that it's what we've covered in here is the three ways of mixing colour. And it's in the palette. So this one here, we mix this in palette. So that was in palette. This one, wet in wet, it was this one. We've messed around with this, but this was mixed on paper, wet in wet. So we mixed on paper, wet in wet. And then, the layering, I suppose, we kind of covered there. So it's the wet in wet in the palette. Sorry, it's the wet in wet in the palette, the wet and wet on the paper, and then this layering that you do it on the page, basically. So you use successive layers of dry paint to produce the colour that you're looking for. So that's three ways, I suppose, of mixing your colour. In your palette, on the page, wet, or on the page, dry. And now that this is probably dry, it's not 100% dry, so I should probably wait a a little while, but we could. I have somewhere got a. It's called a masking fluid eraser. It's like a kind of a coarse rubber that you use to rub this off. I'm just going to try and do this with this. So yeah, it's coming off. I think it's pretty dry. So you can see what's happening here is that latex just rolls up, and we're left with those little white lines, the highlights. And to be honest, that's impossible to produce by leaving, just trying to leave those pieces. You couldn't achieve a smooth background like that, I don't think, and these fine kind of lines going all over the place, typically as whiskers appear on animals. So it's a good technique for producing whiskers. Maybe I should use it more often, but as I said, I don't get on with it. See, and it's important to take this off as soon as it's dry, so don't leave your masking fluid on there overnight. Soon as your painting is dry, just start rubbing it off. And actually this piece of tissue paper has worked quite well, lifted that off. And you can see here almost where the masking fluid has gone, used that dry brush technique, it's gone on with lots of masking fluid and faded out here. So you're kind of getting the reverse dry brush technique, you know, where the masking fluid has only just touched the paper. It's formed a resist, so you can get some texture. It doesn't have to be solid white in the areas that you mask. Yeah, something that you might consider doing as well is splashing with a bit of masking fluid. You know, put some splashes down, and then yeah, you can rub those on afterwards and you get some bright highlights. What I tend to do is use gouache, wait till the painting's dry and sort of splash it on afterwards if that's what I want, or apply it gently. There's one other thing that I suppose that I use, and that is salt. So I'm just going to grab, don't mind what colour have I got here. Let's grab some, sorry, my brushes are in a bit of a mess. Making a bit of a mess here. Grab this, some more of this blue. I just want to show you, just dropping some salt onto a picture. So I'm going to go over this bit so that you can see it. I don't want this to be too wet, so I'm going to lift out any kind of real excess water. What I found with salt is if you get too much water on there, you kind of, the salt just dissolves and you end up with a bit of a mess. It doesn't really work, or certainly doesn't give the effect. So you want your paper to be damp, not too wet, I would have said, and it's sometimes good to just leave it for a second until you apply the salt, just so it sinks in, starts to dry a little bit. The salt that I use is Malden salt, and it is fantastic. I discovered it through art and producing these techniques, but I eat it on my food. So this generally lives in the kitchen, and I have to come and steal it to do paintings now. So this comes in big flakes. I'll just put a bit here. You can see the big chunks, random sizes, you know, little bits. And I'm going to spread it across here. So there's an area here where it's totally dry, more or less, I think. And if I just drop the salt onto that, nothing's going to happen. It's dry. Where it's too wet, the salt dissolves and you kind of lose the effect. But where you've got the perfect kind of dampness of your paper, it produces a really nice kind of crystalline effect and just pushes the paint out. So I'm just going to leave that there. It takes a little while for it to work, and you can just watch that as it appears. So you just leave the salt on there, and you can see that it will start to push all of that paint out. And once it's dry, you clear off the salt, and some of it does tend to get stuck a little bit, but I'm just going to show you here. So where it's too dry, you've got no effect at all. Just cleaning that salt off. See, so you've got to get it. And actually, it probably could have gone on when it was maybe a little bit wetter. You're starting to get an effect here, and you need to leave it, because what it's doing is, I don't know whether it pushes the pigment away. So it kind of pushes the pigment away in these kind of crazy shapes. And yeah, you need to allow it time for it to do that. It might not look like it's doing much, but just leave it. And it'll produce lovely textures. It's really good. I know that I've got an iguana that I'm planning to do, and it just forms the scaly texture of their skin perfectly. So yeah, I will be using salt. So going back to this one, I think I said at the time, so when you're adding the white, we were adding it to a wet surface, and I said it would do this, it would bleed in, ceases to become completely white. It's a nice effect. But if you want to cover that, you wait for it to dry. Nice strong mix, not too much water of your white gouache. And now if I apply these flicks over the top of this white, this dry, you can see that it's going to retain those crisp edges. That paint won't go anywhere now. It will stay in those shapes and it will just dry and look like that. So yeah, okay, it's wet in wet versus wet in dry, and we've done the layering here as well. So just in this little page, you know, you've got wet in wet, wet in dry, you've got some splashing, we've created a wash of a flat area to start with. So just in practicing these little areas, you can master quite a few techniques. And I recommend you get a page like this and just play around. I often still do this. I quite enjoy this process. And that's just playing, really. You know, I could add more. If I flicked some clean water into this white, for example, we could make it bleed out if we wanted to. So see, we can just make that bleed out in certain areas. Splash it on. You know, there's a big splash across the middle there. Take some paint with it. Use these splashes to your advantage. And I guess maybe looking specifically at splashing, some people use so like a toothbrush. I've seen people using toothbrushes, and it's an effective way of getting lots of spray, I suppose, onto your painting. I tend to find it a bit too uniform. You can kind of only get one effect with a toothbrush, and that's splatter. You know, you flick it and it flicks little dots everywhere. I've seen people use them for painting starry skies at night and that kind of stuff. You know, flick a few white dots on it and those will appear as stars. So that it's generally quite even, round dots. It's difficult to produce any variety, I'd have said. And that's what the kind of the flicking technique I use is my finger and a brush, essentially. And by controlling the amount of paint that I have on my brush, the amount of water, the speed of the flick, the distance my finger is from the page is going to vary those marks, and also the direction that I am flicking in. So I'll always try and, if I flick, so if I'm putting in a flick for a tail of a bird or a wing going up somewhere, or, you know, something really expressive, you've got to follow the lines of the bird. So you're almost drawing your painting, but with a flick. So if this was the tail of a bird or something, say it was going that way, I would do it this way. It's difficult for the camera to pick up. Hopefully you can get that from the side one, but there. So you're flicking down the tail like that, down the tail. And I like these drops, you know, depending on whether it's right for that particular place. You know, either it works there in the painting or it doesn't. You can leave it, or you could just dab it out. And if you're quite quick and quite bold with it, you can make it just totally disappear. So I'd practice kind of, all you've got to really be able to do is flick in a circle. So a good thing to do is, you know, you want to be able to flick in any direction, I suppose. So the easiest way for you to see what I'm doing is if I'm flicking like that. All I have to do is angle my finger, and then I'm flicking up there, and then I'm there, and then I'll go round like this. Hopefully you see that overhead, and then this way. Now I want another one in there. A little bit more paint, a little bit more water. Another one down there. Now I want one down this way. So you do have to go at some funny angles sometimes, but you see I'm controlling quite well where my splash starts and the direction that it goes. Kind of difficult often to control the length. You know, sometimes it can shoot off But the higher you do it, I found if you do it high up, you get a long splash. If you could do it quite close, bring your finger close to the paper, you can do a smaller splash. And obviously just controlling the size of your splash. You know, I do some quite detailed splashing sometimes, so I'll work on quite a small area and just try and highlight something in a small little way. Look, maybe this was a spider's web. I've never painted a spider's web, but it just kind of looked like one. So I might want to put these side webs in. This is a good little practice technique actually. Paint a spider's web in flicks. Just help you get them kind of in the right place. You know, get your angles all over the place. Sorry if you can't see all of these, but you know what I'm doing. So yeah, try and do a spider's web. It will get you to start from one point and flick outwards, and then try and join that round with lines. And then that will help you get used to following the direction and flicking in different ways with different intensities. It's really, I suppose, it's about getting the right amount of water and pigment on your brush. If it's too dry, it's not going to flick. If it's too much water, you're going to, I mean, you might want a lot of water. Sometimes I will grab a whole lot of water with a whole lot of pigment and just go mad. You know, you want a big splash. Big splash. You know, you can go mad with it. You can also do it very controlled in the direction you want. I quite like some of the freedom and the unknown nature of, you know, it's expressive painting, splashing around. I don't tend to do a lot of splashing like that. I've seen a lot of people do a kind of a flick technique like this. So I've seen people flicking, and I suppose for an area of texture it might be quite good. I always come back to this flicking technique that I use. If you want a splat of colour, I suppose, in one spot, you could do that. But yeah, I like these. So look, you can carry on your spider's web round, following it round. And I'm still waiting for this to kind of dry and produce its effect. This salt over here, I think perhaps it could have been a little wetter. Although you can see there, if I do move away a little bit of that, so it's not quite dry enough, and if I'd have left it to dry, it probably would have done more. But you can see how it's leaving this texture, little spots. Probably needs to be slightly damper to get the full effect of it. And yeah, so again, the lifting out, you know, maybe I've done this big splash, and I want to lift it out. You know, you can get most of that out if you wanted. Take it out. I think if you can practice those few techniques, it might look a bit chaotic and a bit overwhelming, but it's really a few simple techniques. So I hope this has been useful for you. We'll be covering these techniques in all of the tutorials and stuff. This was just supposed to be a kind of introduction and an overview of the techniques that I'll be using throughout this series. So yeah, I hope it's been useful for you, and I'll see you in one of the tutorials.